No one was in sight or hearing range. I thought about the morality of my intentions, the possibility that the girl was telling the truth, and the benefits of proceeding without interruption or delay. There was also a certain inexplicable allure to the danger and risk involved in this attempt. I scorned the barriers that pride, caprice, and false notions of decorum created in human interactions. I wanted to see another person and make her happy, even though it was uncertain whether she was even within 20 paces of where I stood. The only way to find out was to examine the space. I climbed to the second story and approached a closed door. I knocked, and after a moment, a gentle voice asked, "Who is there?" The voice was as sweet as Clemenza's, but different in other ways. I had no particular topic to discuss with this person. I didn't answer, but I hesitated to leave. Suddenly the voice spoke again. "What do you want? Why won't you answer? Come in." I obeyed the command and entered the room. I had come here deliberately and with caution, not by chance or whim. Therefore, instead of being thrown off balance by what I saw, I remained calm and resolute. However, my curiosity made me an attentive observer. I saw two women, dressed in a way that suggested they wanted to be alone, lounging carelessly on a sofa. Both of them turned to look at me when I entered. The younger one screamed and jumped up from the sofa, her eyes darting between me, herself, and the room that was in disarray. It was clear that she was aware of how inappropriate this meeting was. The other woman also screamed, but it seemed to be out of surprise rather than fear. Perhaps my appearance and clothing suggested that I had made a mistake and entered the room by accident. However, the older woman decided to adopt an offended tone and looked at me sternly. "What is this? Why have you come here?" she demanded. She was older but still attractive and graceful. She had retained all the beauty that nature had given her, but it was enhanced by her carriage and dress, which made her even more appealing to the senses. However, her appearance was designed to attract those who only sought physical pleasures, and it only served to repel me. I know that my judgment may have been flawed, but I couldn't help feeling that way. As I entered the room, my suspicions were already aroused. I had arrived with the belief that these women were unchaste, and any appearance that confirmed my preconceived notions was eagerly seized upon. However, the younger woman did not inspire the same disgust as her elder companion. Despite having no reason to assume her more virtuous, her modesty appeared genuine, and her discomfort at having already been exposed was palpable. She would have fled if not for the older woman's forceful grip. "What's wrong with the girl? There's nothing to be afraid of." "Hey, you!" she called out to me. "What brings you here?" I approached them, standing before them and gazing intently at the one who had spoken. I spoke seriously and emphatically. "I have come to speak with a woman who used to live in this house and who may still reside here. Her name is Clemenza Lodi. If she is here, I request that you bring me to her immediately." I noticed a fleeting sense of unease, a less imperious and more curious air, in the woman upon hearing Clemenza's name. However, it quickly gave way to a stern and commanding demeanor. "What is your business with her, and why did you come here in this manner? This is a most extraordinary intrusion. Please leave the room. Any questions that can be answered will be answered downstairs." "I did not mean to intrude or offend," I replied calmly. "My motives were neither idle nor impertinent. I waited downstairs for some time after requesting an audience with you through the servant. She informed me that you were absent, and so I was forced to search for Clemenza Lodi myself without a guide. I was eager to leave and asked for directions to the room where she was staying. "I'll direct you," she replied firmly, "to leave the room and the house." I couldn't believe it. "Impossible, madam," I said, still staring intently at her. "Leave the house without seeing her? You might as well tell me to carry the Andes on my head or walk barefoot to Pekin. Impossible." Her anger mixed with concern now. "This is strange insolence, unaccountable behavior. Leave my room. Will you force me to call the men?" I tried to be kinder. "Do not be afraid," I said. "I came to help, not harm. I didn't come to criticize or argue with you, just to counsel and assist someone who needs it. I only want to see her. I didn't come here for you, but for her. Just show me where she is or tell me where to find her, and I'll leave you alone." "Will you make me call those who will punish you for this insolence?" she threatened. "My dear lady, I'm not forcing you to do anything. I'm just asking. If there were men in the house, I'd ask to speak to them, but there aren't, so you'll have to help me. Just let me see Clemenza Lodi for a moment. It won't hurt you, but it will help her. What's the harm?" "This is the most peculiar behavior," she said, bewildered. Is this really the place to talk to you? I warn you, you'll regret staying here." "You're being stubborn," I said, turning to the younger woman who was trembling with fear. I took her hand gently. "Here," I said, "there appears to be purity, innocence, and humility. I expected this house to be a temple of hedonism, inhabited by women who engaged in licentious pleasures. I anticipated finding individuals who were specious, possessing talents, beauty, and charm, but dissolute, lascivious, and driven by their sensual and greedy desires. Yet in your countenance and demeanor, I see signs of virtue. I am often deceived, as the semblance of modesty can be easily assumed. Behind this facade, perhaps, lies a corrupt heart and depraved appetites. Is that the case?" She didn't respond directly, but her expression seemed to confirm my favorable impressions. I also noticed that the older woman became more alarmed as I directed my attention to her companion. Suddenly a thought struck me. This young girl might be in a situation similar to that of Clemenza Lodi. She might be unaware of the true nature of her companions, and could be rescued from similar evils through this encounter. This suspicion filled me with tumultuous emotions, momentarily pushing Clemenza aside. I paid no heed to the older woman's looks or behavior. My focus was solely on the young girl. My eagerness to uncover the truth lent a passionate and intense tone to my voice as I spoke. "Who are you? Do you reside in this house? Are you a sister or daughter of this family, or simply a visitor? Do you know the character, occupation, and intentions of those around you? Do you consider them virtuous, or are you aware of their profligacy? Please speak. I implore you to tell me." The initial blush of embarrassment on the young woman's face began to fade. She raised her eyes and glanced between me and the woman beside her. A look of genuine astonishment spread across her features, and she seemed eager for me to continue. The older woman seemed extremely alarmed and scolded me for my audacity. She demanded that I leave and warned me of the danger I was in by lingering. I paid no attention to her and continued to plead with the younger woman for her true state. Unfortunately, she didn't have the time or inclination to answer me as the older woman continued to interrupt with her clamorous importunities and menaces. It became clear that my attempts were useless, but I knew that I could still achieve my ultimate goal. I could share the knowledge I had obtained through you about Mrs. Villars and her daughters. While this information may have been unnecessary if the woman I was speaking to was a member of that licentious family, it could be of utmost importance to her safety if she wasn't. I resolutely and impetuously silenced the older woman and spoke concisely and honestly. I still held the hand of the younger woman and looked steadfastly at her face, preventing her from lifting her eyes. "I don't know you, and I don't know if you are dissolute or chaste. However, what I am about to say will be useful to you either way. Let me repeat what I have heard, although it is just a rumor and I cannot vouch for its accuracy. I leave it to your judgment and hope that it will guide you toward innocence and honor. Mrs. Villars and her 3 daughters are Englishwomen who once had a spotless reputation, but were later suspected of being involved in prostitution. This secret could not be kept hidden forever, and the profligates who frequented their house eventually exposed them. One of them, who had passed away while they were residing in the countryside, confided in his relative, who was present at his deathbed, about their true nature. The dying man also recounted incidents that greatly concern me. I had an association with a man named Welbeck. In his abode, I encountered an unfortunate girl who was later taken to Mrs. Villars' residence. Her name was Clemenza Lodi. Living under the jurisdiction of a woman such as Mrs. Villars and her daughters could not have been good for her virtue, and I have come to save her from this control. I turned to the elder and continued, "I implore you, in the name of all that is holy, to tell me if Clemenza Lodi is under this roof. If she is not, where has she gone? I came here to find out, and I will not leave until I get an answer." As I spoke, the woman's anger began to ignite. It erupted into a flood of insults directed towards me. She called me a villain, a liar, and a thief, and accused me of lurking around the house until those who were stronger than I had left. She claimed that I had entered the premises through deceit, and that I was a despicable and insolent wretch. I knew that it was futile to either refute or tolerate her accusations. The only way to find the satisfaction I sought was to search the house. Without saying a word, I left the room. Did I violate any laws by moving from one floor to another and from one room to another? Did I genuinely deserve to be accused of recklessness and insolence? Admittedly, my actions were ambiguous and risky, and maybe lacking in prudence. but my intentions were pure. I had only one goal in mind, and that was to rescue a human being from misery and degradation. I make no claim to the wisdom of maturity and experience, nor the praise of foresight or cunning. I opt for the straightforward path and pursue it with swift determination. While good intentions alone may cause more harm than good without knowledge, it is important to acknowledge that acquiring knowledge is a gradual process that requires effort. However, we should not remain idle simply because we lack knowledge. Our positive intentions should propel us towards action, regardless of the extent of our knowledge. Chapter 23. It was a deviation from the norm to explore the house in such a manner, and the women I had just left were likely unaware of my intentions. They may have attributed my silence upon leaving to their verbal attacks and threats. Nonetheless, I proceeded with my search undisturbed. Eventually, I arrived at a front chamber on the 3rd floor. The door was slightly open, so I entered cautiously. A woman was seated on a low chair near the fireplace. She was dressed in a careless but not indecent manner. Her face was only partially visible due to her posture, but her complexion was sickly and pale, and her form was weak and emaciated. Her eyes were fixed on a baby lying on a pillow at her feet. The child, like its mother, appeared malnourished and near death. It was evident that the woman was Clemenza, although her current appearance was vastly different from her former self in terms of habits, shape, and complexion. All her beauty had faded away, but there was something heart-wrenching about her inconsolable grief. She was completely absorbed in caring for the child, and didn't lift her gaze until I approached and stood before her. She gave a slight start when she noticed me. She glanced at me momentarily, then covered her eyes with one hand while extending the other towards the door, gesturing for me to leave in silence. Although her gesture was emphatic, I could not comply. I desired her attention but was unsure how to express it. I remained silent, unsure if my words would be understood or how she perceived me due to Welbeck's deceit and manipulation. What proposal could I make to ensure her comfort and safety? Once again she covered her eyes and weakly exclaimed, "Go away. Leave." Satisfied with her plea, she returned her focus to her child. She stooped down, lifted the almost lifeless infant in her arms, and anxiously gazed at its fragile features. Embracing it tightly to her chest, she looked at me once more and repeated, "Go away. Go away. Be gone." Her facial expression, tones, and gestures deeply moved me. Additionally, my knowledge of her situation, her lack of friends, her poverty, unrequited love, and the dying infant, added to my anguish. I struggled to find my voice and felt tears welling up. Turning to the window, I attempted to regain my composure. What was my purpose in coming here? I pondered. Surely Welbeck's treachery must have been exposed by now. What can I tell her about the villas that she doesn't already know, or that would be of any use? If they have treated her justly, why should I diminish their merit? Their true nature will be revealed through their actions. Although they may be indulgent, it doesn't necessarily mean they've mistreated this individual. Despite being promiscuous, they may still possess compassion. I cannot offer any improvement to her situation. If she were to leave this residence, where could I take her? Oh, if only I were wealthy enough to provide sustenance for the hungry, shelter for the homeless, and clothing for the naked. My fruitless musings were interrupted by the lady, who abruptly placed the child in its crib and approached me. The forlorn expression on her face had transformed into one of anxious curiosity. "Where," she asked in broken English, "is Signor Welbeck?" "I'm sorry," I replied. "I do not know. That question would be better suited for you than me." "I know where he is. I fear where he is," she said, her heart heavy with grief. She turned away from me and retrieved the child, holding it close. Tears streamed down her face as she silently wept over her child, dampening its pale, sunken cheek. Her behavior piqued my interest and shifted my thoughts. I began to suspect that her distress wasn't solely for her child, but also for Welbeck's fate. "Do you know where Mr. Welbeck is?" I asked. "Is he alive? Is he nearby? Is he in danger?" "I do not know if he is alive. He is sick. He is in prison. They will not allow me to see him." As she spoke, our attention was drawn to the infant, whose previously motionless body began to tremble, its features contorting into a more ghastly expression. The child's breathing was labored, and every attempt to take a breath resulted in a convulsion worse than the last. The mother understood these signs all too well. She mirrored her child's struggle in her own face. Finally, Her agony released itself in a piercing scream. The infant's fight was over. Hope was in vain for a flicker in its heart or eyelids. Its lips were closed, and its breath was gone forever. The sorrow that engulfed the mother was the kind of wild, unthinking grief that could not be contained. A few disjointed movements and screams that tore at the soul were followed by a deep faint. She fell to the ground, as pale and lifeless as her baby. I need not describe the pain that such a scene could evoke. It was made more intense by my helpless and uncertain position. I longed to offer comfort and aid, but I had nothing to give. I was lost in confusion and doubt. I looked from the baby to the mother, sighing and crying and even sobbing. I knelt down and took the lifeless hand of the mother. I bathed it with my tears and cried out, "Ill-fated woman, unhappy mother, what can I do to help you? How can I ease this tragedy and save you from more suffering?" At that moment, the door to the room opened, and the younger of the women I had seen before entered. Her face was filled with alarm and concern. Her eyes were drawn immediately to the frail form and mournful expression of Clemenza. She shuddered at the sight, but said nothing. She stood in the center of the room, wavering and bewildered. I let go of the mother's hand and approached the newcomer. "You have arrived," I said, "just in time. I don't know you, but I will trust that you are kind. Your heart may not be pure, but it still has the capacity for compassion toward those in distress. Your hand is always ready to help the suffering. Look, there lies a lifeless infant. The mother, consumed by grief, has temporarily lost her own life. She has been oppressed and betrayed, stripped of her property and reputation, but not her innocence. She deserves to be rescued. Do you have the arms to hold her? Do you have the empathy, security, and a home to give to a forsaken, betrayed, and miserable stranger? I do not know what this dwelling is. Perhaps nothing more than a brothel. I cannot say what kind of treatment this woman has received. Once her situation and needs have been determined, will you be able to provide for her? Will you rescue her from the dangers that may arise from her continued stay here?" She was taken aback by my sudden address. Eventually she responded, "All that has happened, all that I have heard and seen is so unexpected, so strange, that I am bewildered and confused. I cannot comprehend your behavior, nor your reason for approaching me. I can only answer one thing. If this woman has been harmed, I had no part in it. I was unaware of her existence or situation until this very moment, and whatever protection or assistance she justly deserves, I am both capable and willing to offer. I do not reside here. I am only an occasional visitor to this residence." I exclaimed with enthusiasm and a fervent tone, "So, you are not corrupt, but a stranger to the ways of this house and abhorrent of these ways? Do not deceive me, I implore you. I rely solely on your appearance and declarations, which could be false." These inquiries, which demonstrated my naivety, surprised her. She gazed at me, uncertain whether I was sincere or jesting. After a long pause, she spoke in a peculiar manner. "Your way of speaking is so strange that I am not sure how to respond. I won't bother trying to understand it, but instead I'll let you guess. Who is this woman you speak of, and how can I be of assistance?" After a moment of silence, she continued, "I cannot provide any immediate help to her, and I must leave this place at once." She slipped a card into my hand and said, "This is where you can find me. If you have any proposals concerning this woman, you can come to my house and discuss it with me there." She then left the room, and I watched as she disappeared from sight. I agreed with her that her presence could do more harm than good to Clemenza. Soon after, the older woman came in, her face filled with anger, disappointment, and resentment. However, upon seeing the mother and child, her demeanor shifted. It was clear that she still had some compassion left within her. She called for the servants and began taking action to help the situation. I realized then that my presence could indeed make a difference. I stayed in the room until the baby was covered with a cloth, and the unconscious mother was taken to another room. The woman then turned to me with a scowl and shouted, "Thief! Villain! Why are you still here?" "I am leaving," I replied calmly, "but I wanted to express my gratitude and admiration for your attention to the sufferer. You may think of me as disrespectful and stubborn, but I assure you that my intentions are good. I hope that one day I can prove that to you." "Leave now," she spat in a more aggressive tone. "Leave this place at once, or I shall treat you as a thief," she exclaimed, revealing a pistol from under her gown. "You will witness that I won't tolerate insults without consequence. If you don't depart, I will shoot you like a robber." This woman demonstrated a fearless and resolute character, more fitting for a man. Her movements and words were brimming with vigor, revealing a proud and offended spirit. It was evident that she felt deeply wronged by my actions, but was it certain that her anger was justified? I had hurled unforgivable accusations at her home, yet these accusations might be unfounded. I had formed them based on evidence obtained by chance, and as complex and uncertain as human behavior and motivations can be, this evidence might lack truth. Perhaps, I spoke calmly, I have wronged you. Perhaps I have misunderstood your character. You will find that I am just as willing to remedy my mistake as I was to make it. My error was not deliberate, and before I could finish my sentence, this impulsive and enraged woman aimed the pistol at my head and fired. I had no idea that her fury would drive her to such an extreme. It was almost instinctual for me to raise my hand and try to deflect the weapon. I did so calmly and deliberately, without thinking that she intended to do more than intimidate me. Fortunately, this caution saved my life. The bullet missed my forehead but grazed my left ear, causing a small wound that bled profusely. The deafening sound of the shot and the impact of the bullet on my brain caused me to briefly lose consciousness. I stumbled backward and would have fallen if I hadn't caught myself on the wall. At the sight of my blood, her reason instantly returned. Her anger vanished, replaced by terror and remorse. She clasped her hands together and exclaimed, "Oh, what have I done? My uncontrollable rage has ruined me." I didn't need much time to realize the extent of the harm I had suffered and the appropriate course of action. In that moment, I was both bewildered and alarmed, but I soon understood that this incident could have more positive than negative outcomes. It would teach me to be cautious when dealing with another person's passions, and remind me that anger can sometimes lead us to cross boundaries. Instead of berating my companion, I calmly spoke to her. "Do not be frightened. You have not injured me, and I hope you will learn from this experience. Your impulsive actions nearly cost the life of someone who is your friend, and could have exposed you to infamy, death, or everlasting remorse. Take this as a lesson to control your emotions, particularly when rage threatens to overpower reason. I want to reiterate that my intentions in coming to this house were connected to your well-being and that of Clemenza Lodi. If I made the mistake of assuming you were involved in a vile and harmful profession, it is a mistake that should be corrected through understanding, not through violence or verbal attacks. I am driven by benevolent motives, but I acknowledge that I may make numerous mistakes in the means I employ and the evidence I rely on. Show me the path through which I can bring you good, and I will gladly follow it." Realizing that her fears regarding the consequences of her impulsive act were unfounded, she resumed, though with less intensity than before, her curses directed at my interference and audacious foolishness. I waited until the storm had nearly passed, then declared my intention to return to the house if Clemenza needed me. As I made my way back to the city, I couldn't help but wonder why my life was filled with so many unexpected and dangerous events. Was it fate, or was it my own curiosity that led me to involve myself in other people's lives? I left the safety of my home to join Welbeck, and encountered countless dangers, risking my own virtue. Then I put my life on the line for Wallace, and now I find myself responsible for protecting Eliza Hadwin and the unfortunate Clemenza. Though my desire to help them is strong, I fear my abilities are limited. The offer from the mysterious woman brings some comfort to Clemenza, but I must seek the counsel of my friend Stevens to determine the best course of action. Perhaps it would be wise to move Clemenza to a safer location, away from the memories of her lost child and deceitful lover. The barrier to be built between her and Welbeck must be impenetrable. But wait, did she mention Welbeck? Is he truly in prison and ill? Oh, wretched soul. I believed your journey had reached its end, that the weight of guilt no longer burdened your heart, and that your misdeeds and regrets were laid to rest in an unmarked grave. Yet it seems you are still alive. Is it rational to hold on to the hope of your restoration to innocence and peace? You are not an unfeeling criminal. If you possessed less virtue, your remorse would be less sharp. If you were deaf to the voice of duty, your ventures into guilt and folly would yield less anguish. Perhaps the time will come when the magnitude of your transgressions and calamities becomes overwhelming, and the folly of your choices becomes too evident to ignore. Even for such offenders as you, there is redemptive power in the teachings of truth and the lessons of experience. But you are imprisoned and ill. This may be the turning point in your destiny. Poverty and dishonor were the evils you sought to avoid, but you recklessly sacrificed your integrity and peace of mind. Now you have discovered that the price was paid in vain, that the hollow and deceitful pleasures of wealth and status were not worth the cost, and that the only path to them, albeit frivolous and insubstantial, is one of honesty and diligence. You are in prison and sick, and there is no one to brighten your hours with acts of kindness, or uphold your faltering courage with wise counsel. For souls like yours, the world has no compassion. Mankind will pursue you to the grave with curses. Their cruelty may be justified or excused, since they do not know you. They are unaware of the torment of your conscience and the bitter retribution you endure daily. They are consumed by their own grievances, only thinking of the facade of joy and self-assurance you once displayed in your interactions with them. It is only I who truly know you, and can rightfully assess if you deserve any compassion. I have experienced some of your kindness, and you deserve gratitude from me. Should I not visit and attempt to console you in your distress? Let me, at the very least, determine your condition, and become the instrument of rectifying the wrongs you have inflicted. May I find, through witnessing your misery, renewed motivations for sincerity and righteousness. Lost in these thoughts, I entered the city. My mind was preoccupied with Welbeck. I am not one to postpone till tomorrow what can be done today, for the fate of a person often hangs on the passing of a mere minute. I shall stop, I declared, at the prison, and since the timing of my arrival may hold significance, I shall make my way there with utmost haste. I did not content myself with a leisurely stroll, but disregarding the stares of passers-by, I hurried along the path as fast as I could. Inquiring about Welbeck upon my arrival, I was led through a dimly lit room filled with beds, to a staircase. Never before had I set foot in a prison. Never had I encountered such a foul odor, or beheld faces so stained with filth and misery. The walls and floors were equally repugnant and loathsome. It seemed that in this place, all allurements of existence would be stripped away, and yet the faces that could be discerned through the gloom were either devoid of care or contorted with laughter. This, I muttered as I followed my guide, is Welbeck's abode. What a stark contrast to the tranquility and grandeur of his former dwelling. Here, clamour and the shuffling of unkempt feet are ceaseless. The air is heavy with the stench of illness and debauchery. You find yourself confined in a cramped and stuffy space, perhaps forced to share your cell with a dim-witted brute. In the past, fresh air wafted through your grand windows, and fragrant flowers adorned your hearth. Servants, dressed in finery, entered your quarters with deference, treading lightly on your marble floors, and keeping the sanctity of silence unbroken. Your lamp illuminated the room through alabaster while fragrant liquid poured from porcelain vases. These were the adornments of your hall, the embellishments of your life. But now, alas! We arrived at a room on the second floor. My guide knocked at the door but received no response. Repeated knocks went unanswered. Finally he lifted the latch, and we entered together. The prisoner lay in bed, his face turned away from us. I approached quietly, gesturing for the keeper to leave. Welbeck was not sleeping but lost in thought. I didn't want to interrupt his musings, so I stood still, my eyes fixed on his form. He seemed unaware of our presence. Finally he let out a deep sigh and shifted his position, noticing me for the first time. Remembering our last encounter, Welbeck must have believed I would soon be dead, but his prediction was wrong. He was surprised at first, then humiliated and angry. After staring at me for some time, he turned away, struggling to breathe. He laid his head on the pillow and returned to his thoughts, unwilling or unable to utter a word of welcome or contempt. As I gazed upon his face, I saw a darkness that I had never seen before. The once cheerful countenance was now filled with gloom and malice. The flexible parts of his face that once allowed him to hide his inner turmoil were now gone, leaving behind a monument of ruin. Alas, I muttered loud enough for him to hear. Despair and mischievous passions have taken root in this heart, too deep for me to tear away. He turned to me, his eyes filled with madness that made me shudder. I spoke again, this time with less conviction. "Unhappy Clemenza," I said, "I have done as you asked. I visited him in his sickness and prison. You had cause for anguish and terror, even greater than you imagined. I wish you would be content with my report, that you would leave him to his destiny and let him die alone. But I know that no amount of convincing will make you stay away. You must come and witness for yourself." Little did I know the effect my words would have on Welbeck. Little did I intend to make him believe that Clemenza was about to enter his room, but it was the only way to rouse him from his lethargy, to awaken the attention that I needed. He started up, his eyes filled with fear. "What?" he cried. "What? Is she here? Oh, powers that have scattered sorrows in my path, spare me the sight of her. But I will rescue myself from this agony. If she appears, I will gouge out my own eyes and cast them at her feet." With these words, he stared with intensified eagerness at the door. His hands were poised at his head, ready to carry out his frantic intent. I grabbed his arm and pleaded with him to cast aside his terror, assuring him that Clemenza was far away. She had no intention, and was also incapable of visiting him. Then I am saved. I can breathe again. No, keep her away from this prison. Drag her to the wheel or the gallows. Subject her to stripes and torture her with hunger. Strangle her child before her eyes and cast it to the ravenous dogs that howl at the gate. But do not let her set foot in this prison. Never allow her to enter these doors. He paused, his gaze fixed on the floor, lost in reverie once more. I continued. She is preoccupied with other sorrows that are unrelated to Welbeck's fate. She hasn't forgotten about you. She knows you are sick and imprisoned. I came here to assist you in any way your condition might require, and I came at her suggestion. Alas, she has abundant tears to shed as she mourns the grave of her child. He jolted. What? Dead? Are you saying the child is dead? Yes, the child passed away. I witnessed the death. I saw the child breathe his last in his mother's arms, that same mother whom I once encountered under your roof, vibrant and cheerful, but whom misfortune has tarnished and withered. I saw her clad in poverty, dwelling under a cursed roof, desolate, alone, devoid of solace from the presence or sympathy of others, approached only by those who mock her distress, set traps for her innocence, and push her towards infamy. I saw her bending over the face of her dying child. Welbeck clutched his head and exclaimed, "Curses upon your lips, infernal messenger! Sing your mournful song elsewhere. Vanish, unless you wish to feel in your heart fangs stained with blood less guilty than yours." Until this moment, Welbeck's tumultuous mind seemed to prevent him from clearly recognizing me. Now it appeared as if the events of our encounter suddenly sprang to his recollection. "What? This is the villain who rifled my cabinet, the one responsible for my poverty and all the subsequent evils it has spawned, the very person who led me to this prison. You despicable fool. You are the author of the scene you describe and countless nameless horrors. Whatever crimes I have been compelled to commit since that encounter, and the fit of madness that led you to destroy my belongings, they all stem from your actions. They arose out of necessity that would have never existed had you refrained from your fateful deed. How dare you intrude upon my privacy? Why am I not alone? Leave. Spare my miseries at least from the aggravation of seeing their author. My eyes loathe the sight of you. My heart would suffocate you with its bitterness. Go away." "I don't know," I replied, "why innocence should tremble before the ravings of a lunatic, why it should be overwhelmed by undeserved reproaches, why it should not lament the errors of its enemy, strive to correct those errors, and thank your fate, young man, that my hands are restrained by my disdain. Thank your fate that no weapon is within my reach. Much has transpired since I last saw you, and I am a changed man. I am no longer fickle and cowardly. I have no motives other than contempt to prevent me from atoning for the wrongs you have done me with your blood. I scorn taking your life. Go, and let your fidelity, at least, to the trust I have placed in you remain unbroken. You have already caused me enough harm, but if you choose, you can inflict even more. You can betray the secrets that reside within your heart, and rob me of the comfort of knowing that my guilt is known only to one living being." This suggestion made me pause and reflect on the past. I had confided this man's story to you. The secrecy upon which he relied so heavily was now shattered. Was I at fault or not? But why should I dwell on the past with anguish and uncertainty? The future was within my control, and the path of my duty was clear. I would reveal the truth to Welbeck, and willingly face the consequences. I would seek the help of my friend, and seek his advice in this critical situation I found myself in. I should not rely solely on myself in my efforts to help this individual, when there was someone nearby whose insight, benevolence, understanding of humanity, and ability to provide assistance far surpassed my own. Guided by these thoughts, I left the room without saying a word, and obtaining pen and paper, I sent you the note that led to our meeting. Slaught's listeners remained silent, engrossed in the story. As it concluded, a deep stillness settled over the room. The clock on the mantel had chimed twice, its sound unnoticed by us. Now it struck for the third time. It was 1 o'clock. Our guest appeared somewhat taken aback by this signal, and he looked at the clock with a mournful intensity. There was an air of restlessness about him that I had not observed to such a degree before. I was filled with curiosity about other events that had occurred, but I felt it would be inappropriate to continue the conversation after he had undergone so much fatigue. "Let us retire to bed, my friend," I said. "It is late, and after all the physical and mental exertion you've experienced, you must be in need of some rest. Much has happened in your absence that you should know, but it's best to discuss it tomorrow. I'll come to your room at daybreak and fill you in on the details." "Don't leave on my account," he replied. "If I go to bed, it won't be to sleep but to think, especially since you've told me that something important has happened in my absence. My thoughts, regardless of any reason for sorrow or fear, have been set in motion, and solitude and darkness won't stop them. We can never know too much for our own safety and integrity, or learn it too soon." "What has happened?" I had no problem agreeing to his request. I knew that no matter how tired his body may be, the events of the day would not easily escape his mind at night. I told him about my conversation with Mrs. Althorpe. He smiled at the parts involving himself, but when I mentioned his father's immorality and poverty, he broke down in tears. "Poor man. I could have easily predicted this outcome, having known you in your better days. I foresaw your poverty and degradation the moment I left your home." My soul was saddened by the prospect, but I told myself it couldn't be prevented, and that thought helped alleviate my grief. "But now that your ruin is complete, it seems as if some of it is my fault for abandoning you when you needed your son's help and guidance the most. You are ignorant and wicked, but you are still my father. I realized that the suffering of a better man than you would trouble me less than your own. Perhaps I still have the power to restore your freedom and good reputation, but that is a foolish hope. You are beyond the age where the ignorance and base habits of a human being can be cured." He paused, and after a gloomy silence continued, "I am neither surprised nor distressed by the misunderstandings my neighbors have about my character. People judge based on what they see and form their conclusions from their knowledge. I never saw anything in their reproaches except a commendable abhorrence of vice. They were too eager to blame, to gather materials for criticism rather than praise. It was not me they hated and despised. It was the phantom that bore my name, which existed only in their imagination, and was deserving of all their scorn and enmity. What I appeared to be in their eyes was just as disapproving to me as it was to them. Their reproaches only demonstrated the rightness of their judgments, as well as my own. They provided me with new reasons to be content with myself. They strengthened my resolve in the path I had chosen as the best one, and they raised my self-esteem. They increased the claim of those who reproached me to my respect and gratitude. They believed me to be lazy, indifferent to knowledge and devoid of any thirst for it, insolent and immoral. They say that in my treatment of my father, I have been ungrateful and inhumane. I have stolen his property and abandoned him in his calamity. Therefore they hate and revile me. Well, I love them for these demonstrations of their discernment and integrity. Their righteous indignation towards wrongdoing is the truest test of their virtue. Indeed, it is true that they misunderstand me, but such misconceptions arise from the circumstances of our shared situation. They examined what was visible to them and grasped what was within their reach. To judge contrary to appearances, to make judgments based on what they did not know, would render them irrational and brutish. Their judgments would hold no value, and they would themselves become objects of neglect and contempt. It is true that I despised school. I sought opportunities to be absent, and eventually, upon being struck by the teacher, I resolved never to enter his presence again. I loved to leap, run, swim, climb trees, and scramble up rocks. I enjoyed hiding in thickets and wandering through the woods. I followed the impulse of the moment, sometimes speaking incessantly, and at other times choosing silence according to my mood. All of this I loved more than following a set path, going to and fro at appointed hours, staring at a book, reading a specific amount and type, and standing up and sitting down as someone else saw fit. I detested being categorized, confined, scolded, and punished at the whim of someone who, in my eyes, seemed to have no basis for rewards other than caprice and no reason for punishments other than anger. It is true that I avoided taking up the spade and the hoe as much as possible. I preferred to wander in the forest and linger on the hill. I constantly sought to change my surroundings, to examine the endless variety of objects, to compare one leaf and pebble with another, and to follow the trains of thought that their similarities and differences evoked. Exploring what gave them their particular place, structure, and form was a more enjoyable pursuit than ploughing and threshing. My father could easily afford to hire laborers for such tasks. What I was capable of doing at my age and with my constitution could be accomplished by a robust boy in half the time, with half the effort, and without any reluctance. The boy could be a bonded servant, and the cost of his clothing and food would be next to nothing. My service would indeed have saved him even that expense, but my reasons for declining the effort were not hasty or superficially examined. These were my reasons. Firstly, my physique was delicate and weak. Exposure to harsh weather and intense sun would undoubtedly make me ill. My father was indifferent to this consequence, and no level of diligence would please him except that which would jeopardize my health. My health mattered more to my mother than to me. She was more concerned with protecting me from potential harm than reason might justify. She was anxious, and I could alleviate her anxiety only by abstaining from labor almost entirely. I believed her peace of mind had value, and if one of my parents' inclinations had to be satisfied at the expense of the other, it should be the preference of the woman who gave me birth, who cared for me in sickness, who watched over my safety with unwavering tenderness, whose life and peace were intertwined with mine. I would have considered myself brutish and heartlessly wicked to burden her with fears and worries solely to appease the stubborn old man, whose greed demanded that I sacrifice my comfort and health, and who would shift the responsibility of caring for me when sick, and mourning for me when dead onto others. Secondly, I believed I needed to reflect on the impact of my decision on my own happiness. I had to weigh the benefits of my father's profit from my labor against the advantages of mental stimulation, the joys of being in nature, the invigorating sensations of good health, and the luxury of contemplation and daydreaming. The money gained was insignificant and despicable. It served no practical purpose, bringing no true enjoyment. Instead, it fueled an appetite that my father couldn't resist. It nurtured his depravity and brought misery to my mother. When I first shared my story with you, I didn't spend much time on my family's background or domestic affairs. I deemed it irrelevant to the tale of Welbeck and my role in it, but I also couldn't bear the pain of recounting their sufferings. My mind and body are weak, and I can't bear to witness the agony of those I love, so I often resort to forgetting what I can't bear to remember. I previously mentioned that my father was hard-working and sober, but habits are not constant. There were times when his calm demeanor would transform into a raging demon. He didn't seek out alcohol, but he couldn't resist the pressure of others. Even a small amount would turn him into a madman. I also mentioned my sister, who was destroyed by a villain, but her destruction was not complete. A cruel and unforgiving parent who didn't hesitate to throw her and her newborn baby out of the house, along with the curses and insults from her own brothers, left her with no choice but to take her own life. But I can't dwell on these thoughts. I can't bear to think of the wrongs my mother suffered at the hands of her beloved daughter. My brothers were no different from my father, both in temperament and appearance. My mother cherished the hope of seeing her image reflected in her daughter and me. However, her daughter was taken from her through self-inflicted violence, and her other children succumbed to illness. I alone remained to receive her love and fulfill her aspirations. This alone provided ample reason for me to safeguard my health and my life. Yet my father's character presented a motive that was infinitely more compelling. It is almost unbelievable, but true nonetheless, that the only person who could influence my father in moments when his reason had abandoned him was myself. Despite my lack of physical strength, I was able to prevent him from committing acts of brutal violence against my mother. With a single look or outcry from me, he would be halted in the midst of his ferocious actions. The fear of my reproach even had some influence in helping him resist temptation. If I entered a tavern just as he was raising a glass to his lips, I did not hesitate to snatch it from his hand and shatter it on the ground. I was undeterred by the presence of others, and their criticisms of my lack of filial respect and duty were met with indifference. I chose not to justify myself by recounting the domestic miseries or eliciting pity for my mother, knowing that it would only intensify her distress. The world viewed my behavior as insolent and irrational to the point of madness. Denying my father a harmless indulgence as others saw it, and publicly interfering with his social enjoyment, exposing him to humiliation and shame, drew loud condemnations. However, my obligation to my mother prevented me from evading this criticism on any other terms. Now, there is no longer a need to conceal what transpired in our private lives, and I would willingly confess the truth before any audience. Initially, my father believed that threats and physical abuse would intimidate me into submission. However, he soon realized his mistake, and the recognition of this error instilled in him an involuntary reverence for me, which placed limits on his excessive behavior that scorned any other form of control. This, in turn, provided me with further reasons to value a life that was so valuable to my mother in numerous ways. Now, my circumstances have changed. I am no longer in a position where the law, as well as reason, would recognize my rights, as I did when there was some semblance of ownership in my father. I must now take risks, even risking my life if necessary, in the pursuit of honest means of subsistence. During my time in Mr. Hadwin's service, I never spared myself, and had it been a harsher season, I would likely have faced some danger due to my diligence. These were the reasons for my apparent idleness, which my neighbors labeled as such because I abstained from the typical toils of farm work. However, in truth, my time was far from being completely unoccupied by manual labor. It was just that these tasks required less physical or mental exertion, or they were more closely connected to intellectual endeavors. I carried them out in the seclusion of my room, or in the depths of the woods. I did not strive to conceal them, but neither was I eager to attract attention. It was enough that the criticism from my neighbors was undeserved, which made me view it with indifference. I did not seek the company of people my own age, not due to sullen or unsociable habits, but simply because those around me were vastly different from myself. Their interests and occupations were incompatible with mine. In my few books, in my writing, and in the plant and animal life around me, I found companions who adapted their visits and interactions to my convenience and whims, and with whom I never grew tired of conversing. I was not oblivious to the opinion my neighbors held regarding my supposed improper connection with Betty Lawrence. I do not regret my association with that girl. Her company has enlightened me in ways that some may deem impossible for one who has never delved into the sordid depths of city debauchery. Her audacious and curious nature, developed over 10 years of city living, allowed her to impart knowledge to me that I would have never otherwise acquired. Her character was loose and cunning, lustful and brazen, a product of the influences of city life on her crude yet active mind. I observed her closely and studied her ways. I am unsure how to defend myself against accusations of impropriety or describe the exact nature of our relationship. I treated her with familiarity and sometimes even levity, as I had no reason to hold back. I was built in a way that she could not arouse my desires. The temptations that could lead me astray were entirely different from Betty's artifices. She had no power over my senses. I watched her as she performed her tricks and charms, much like observing a salacious and indolent creature in a sty. I tried to maintain my observations without hindrance, not to control my desires, but to suppress my revulsion. My challenge was not to abstain from giving in to her, but rather to avoid repulsing her with anger. We did not cross any lines of propriety immediately, but rather made uncertain advances that were then replaced with more shameless and direct attempts when they proved unsuccessful. She was not well versed in human nature, and failed to see that her last resort was always worse than her previous attempts, and that the more she abandoned decency, the more obstacles she created for herself. Betty had many physical enticements. With her rosy complexion, smooth skin, and plump figure, it appears that this woman, lacking in modesty, resorted to various artifices in her attempts to entice me. However, her efforts proved fruitless in the face of my indifference. In her desperation, she went to extreme lengths, which I will refrain from describing in detail here, as it would serve no beneficial purpose. These actions did not achieve the desired results for her, but they did bring about an unintended consequence that was not entirely displeasing to her. One night, an incident occurred that led a shrewd observer to deduce the existence of an illicit affair. It was futile to try to correct his misconception by explaining the appearances in a manner consistent with my innocence. This mode of explanation implied a level of self-control in me that he denied could be possible. In matters of vice and virtue, people often judge possibilities based on their own character. This astute observer, knowing his own inability to resist temptation, sagely concluded that the temptation must be irresistible to any other man, and swiftly propagated the belief among my neighbors that the woman who married my father had also been involved with me in a promiscuous manner. Although I never admitted the truth of this slanderous accusation, I found it pointless to deny it, as no one would believe my denial, and I had no means to disprove it. Chapter 24. It seems that our young friend and I had to postpone further inquiries until the next day. I shared with him the perplexing information I had received from Wortley regarding Mrs. Wentworth and her nephew. According to Wortley, Mrs. Wentworth's nephew, Clavering, was actually alive and had been seen in Charleston. This news did not seem to elicit guilt or embarrassment from our young friend. Instead, he appeared interested in hearing more. I explained that Mrs. Wentworth had received a letter from Clavering's father, who was currently in Europe. The letter stated that Clavering had been encountered in Charleston, and it detailed the efforts made by his father to persuade him to return home, efforts that seemed to hold promise. I asked for our young friend's thoughts on the matter. After a moment of reflection, he replied, "I can only reject it as untrue. The person who corresponded with Clavering's father may have been deceived. The father himself may have been deceived, or he may have found it necessary to deceive his aunt. There are various possibilities regarding the source of this error, but an error it surely is. Clavering is not alive. I know the room where he died, and I know the withered pine tree under which he is buried." I expressed concern that if Mrs. Wentworth was indeed deceived, it would be difficult to correct her misconception. He replied confidently, "I hope not. A sincere and straightforward account will be sufficient. I plan to visit her and tell her the truth. My narrative will be detailed and consistent, leaving no room for her disbelief." I expressed doubt, noting that Mrs. Wentworth harbored strong prejudices against him and might not even grant him a hearing. He responded, "She will have no choice. Unless she locks her door against me or refuses to listen, she will hear me out. Her preconceived notions are understandable, but they can be easily dispelled by telling her the truth. Why does she suspect me of deceit? It is because of my association with Welbeck, and because I have concealed the truth from her. It is not her fault that she thinks poorly of me, but rather my misfortune. Luckily, this misfortune can be easily remedied," Slaught declared. He was determined to see Mrs. Wentworth as soon as possible, along with visiting Welbeck in prison. However, I cautioned him about the dangers and complications he might face. I explained that Welbeck was being pursued by individuals he had defrauded, and that he was seen as an accomplice in Welbeck's crimes. There was already a warrant for his arrest. Curiously, he asked how he could be considered a partaker in Welbeck's crimes. I admitted that I did not know the exact reasons, but living with Welbeck, fleeing with him, and aiding in his escape might have contributed to the suspicion surrounding him. "Do these actions constitute crimes?" he questioned. "I don't believe so, but they do make you susceptible to suspicion," I replied. "Does this mean I will be arrested and punished?" he asked further. "Possibly detained for a while, but that alone won't lead to punishment," was the response. "Ah, then I have nothing to fear," he concluded optimistically. I cautioned him that he might still face imprisonment and public disgrace. He acknowledged this, but deemed exile and hiding to be even more formidable. He decided that he would not avoid scrutiny and preferred to face the consequences. He asked if I would accompany him to visit Welbeck, and I agreed. Upon inquiring about Welbeck, we learned that he was in his own apartment within the prison, seriously ill. The prison physician had been called, but had faced Welbeck's stubborn silence, refusing to explain his condition or accept any aid. We proceeded to Welbeck's room without any objections from the guards. Despite Welbeck's declining health, there was a glimmer of joy in his eyes upon seeing our young friend. He seemed to recognize me as well and allowed us to enter. "How are you this morning?" Martin asked, settling himself by the bedside and holding the sick man's hand. The feeble patient struggled to respond. "I will soon be well. I've been longing to see you. I need to share a few words before I go." He then turned his tired eyes toward me. "You are his friend," he continued. "You know everything. You may stay." A long pause followed, during which he closed his eyes and seemed to surrender to a state of oblivion. His pulse, barely perceptible, weakened further. After a few minutes, he regained some strength and focused his gaze on Slaught. Speaking with a broken and feeble voice, he resumed. "Clemenza, you have seen her. I left her in a wretched place weeks ago. Yet she has not suffered harm. Neglected and abandoned, yes, but not harmed. Save her, Slaught. Bring her solace. Awaken compassion for her sake. I cannot disclose everything that has occurred. The story would be too long and sorrowful. However, in fairness to the living, I must share something. My sorrows and crimes will be buried with me, some of them, but not all. By now I should have been far out at sea. But fate intervened when I stumbled upon a newspaper just as I was about to embark. It revealed that a treasure was buried alongside the remains of the ill-fated Watson. I was destitute, and succumbed to the temptation of making that treasure mine. Believing myself forgotten or counted among the victims of disease, I daringly returned, disguised carelessly. Under the cover of darkness, I ventured into the vaults of that abandoned house. I dug up my friend's bones and unearthed the belt with its valuable contents, precisely as described in the newspaper. I hurried back to Baltimore with my newfound prize, but eventually my ill fortune caught up with me. I was recognized by Jameson's agents, captured and brought here, where I shall meet my fate and evade the wrath of my creditors through death. But before that, Welbeck extended his left hand to Slaught, and after some hesitation revealed a roll of lead. "Take this," he said. "In its usage let your honesty guide you, as well as the same clue that led me to discover it. Once it is secured, I will bid farewell to the world forever. Leave now, for your presence cannot aid me." Reluctant to comply with his request, we remained in his chamber for a while longer, but our well-intentioned presence proved futile. He swiftly fell back into unconsciousness, never to recover, and passed away the following day. Such was the fate of Thomas Welbeck, cut down in the prime of his life. Although I was interested in following my young friend's journey, an unforeseen emergency compelled me to leave the city once again. A relative to whom I owed many obligations was suffering from a lingering illness, and with good reason believed that his end was near. He implored me to be by his side, to provide comfort during his final moments. Though I was eager to unravel the mysteries surrounding Martin's actions and shield him from the impending troubles I feared he would face, I could not decline my kinsman's invitation, as his residence was only a day's journey from the city. I had to settle for occasional updates conveyed through Slaught's letters, or those from my wife. Upon leaving the prison, I hurried to inform Slaught about the true nature of the recent events. Through this extraordinary turn of events, the Morrises' property was now in the hands of an honest individual. Welbeck, driven by self-interest, had accomplished what anyone else would have deemed a perilous and challenging task. How this plan was conceived or executed remains undisclosed, and it is of no consequence for us to know. What matters is that we now possess the means to restore the rightful inheritance and sustenance to a deserving and impoverished family. Upon returning home, I shared with Slaught all the details I had recently learned about Williams and the Morrises from Wortley. He listened attentively, and when I finished recounting the story, he said, "So, within this small package lies the financial support and livelihood of an entire family. It is only fitting to return it to them. But how? Where do they reside?" I informed him that Williams and Watson's wife live in Baltimore, and the Morrises reside near that town. The advertisements mentioned by Wortley, which can be found in any newspaper, will provide us with the necessary information. However, we first had to ascertain that all the bills described by Williams were contained within this bundle. We carefully unraveled the lead wrapping and discovered the bills that Williams had described. Nothing seemed to be missing, although we were not fully qualified to make such a determination. We considered the possibility that some of the bills belonging to Williams might be incomplete, and we pondered the consequences of presenting them to him if any had been withheld by Welbeck. Slaught resolved this dilemma by suggesting that the advertisement describing these bills would provide us with comprehensive details. His idea was once we located the Morrises and Mrs. Watson, we were to visit them and do our best to alleviate their anxieties. I was surprised that he wanted to travel to Baltimore, and instead suggested sending the papers by post. I explained to him that delivering it himself might raise suspicions, and that he might become entangled in unforeseen difficulties. Slaught couldn't think of any problems that may arise. He believed that the rightful owners would be satisfied if they received the papers. However, I expressed my concern that there might be questions regarding how the papers had been obtained since Watson had disappeared. There's strong suspicion that Welbeck had something to do with it, and his close association with the man, which is known to many, would put him in peril. Despite these potential difficulties, He was determined to go ahead with his plan, saying that an honest and straightforward approach was necessary. He accepted his responsibility and acknowledged that he would face any consequences that might arise. I, in turn, expressed my trust in his abilities and agreed to leave him to handle the situation. We would be temporarily separated, but I told him that I expected to be kept informed of any developments. With that agreement, we parted ways, and I hurried to embark on my intended journey. I'm glad, my friend, that you've made good progress with your writing. What's left of my story can be finished quickly. Right now, I have some free time, and while there are other things I could do, none of them would be easier or more enjoyable than continuing with this story. So let me continue where you left off. First, let me tell you about the plans I made when I last saw my friend. I had a few things in mind. One was to have a conversation with Mrs. Wentworth, and another was to meet the person I encountered at Villers's. When I thought about Clemenza and how lonely she must be, it touched my heart, and I decided to focus my efforts on helping her. To do that, I needed to visit a woman who had given me directions to Clemenza's house. Her name is Axa Fielding, and she said she lived at number 40 Walnut Street without wasting any time. I went there, but unfortunately, she wasn't home. After learning from a servant when Axa Fielding might be available, I headed to Mrs. Wentworth's house. Lost in my thoughts, I entered the house without much consideration for formalities and made my way to the parlor where we had previously met. Once there, I began contemplating the topics I would discuss and how I would introduce myself. I realized that I had entered without warning and moved around without being noticed, purely due to my absent-mindedness. No one was in sight or earshot. Uncertain about my next move, I contemplated quietly returning to the outer door and getting the servant's attention by knocking. However, just as I was about to do so, I heard footsteps in the hallway that made me pause. Standing in the middle of the room, I attentively listened to the approaching sounds, and soon enough, Mrs. Wentworth herself entered the parlor. It appeared that she hadn't expected to find anyone there, so she was taken aback when she noticed a man in the room. In a commanding tone, she asked, "Pray, how did you come here, sir? And what is your business?" I didn't respond with arrogance or excessive humility. I had no intention of appeasing her anger or reveling in her distress. Instead, I answered confidently and respectfully, "Madam, I came here to see you and speak with you. However, my mind was preoccupied with other thoughts, and I forgot to knock at the door. I assure you no harm was intended by my oversight, although I do acknowledge a lack of propriety. Will you please pardon this intrusion and kindly give me your attention?" Mrs. Wentworth responded with skepticism and accusation, stating, "To what? What do you have to say to me? I know you only as an accomplice to a villainous plot to deceive me." Mrs. Wentworth responded sternly, demanding that I leave her house just as I had entered it. Though her words chastised me, I chose not to comply with her request. Instead, I spoke up, my eyes lowered in humility. "Madam, I understand that my actions may make it seem like I deserve your treatment. I am aware that appearances are against me, but those appearances are false. I have not conspired against your reputation or your wealth. I have only spoken the truth. I came here with no selfish or deceitful intentions. I do not seek any favors or have any requests, except that you allow me to clear up the misunderstandings you hold about me. I am poor and without fame or family. I have nothing to rely on in my obscurity and poverty except the approval of my own conscience and the good opinion of those who truly know me. It may be that good people are led to despise and condemn me. Their dislike and scorn will not make me unhappy, but it is in my interest and my duty to correct their mistaken beliefs if I can. I hold your character in high regard. You have misjudged me as a liar and impostor, and I have come here to correct that misunderstanding. My intention is not necessarily to gain your esteem, but to dispel any hatred and suspicion. But there is more to my purpose than that. You are also mistaken about the situation of your nephew, Clavering. I previously told you that I witnessed his death and assisted in his burial. However, my account was unclear and incomplete. Since then, you have received information that you choose to believe, stating that he is still alive. All I ask now is for your attention as I explain the details of my knowledge. The value of my honesty or guilt may not matter to you, but the welfare of your nephew deserves to be known. It could greatly impact your happiness and future actions. It cannot harm you to listen to me, and it may even benefit you. May I continue? Throughout my request, My companion showed little sign of forgiveness or respect. "I will listen," she replied. "Your lies may entertain if they do not teach. But please, keep it brief." I had no choice but to accept her rude terms and began my tale. I detailed my father's home, including the year, month, day, and hour her nephew arrived. I described his physical appearance, clothing, voice, and mannerisms. I even recounted his favorite gestures and attitudes. As I spoke, my companion's demeanor shifted as I predicted. Her knowledge of the young man and his disappearance made it impossible for me to deceive her with such a detailed narrative. Every word and incident matched her previous knowledge, proving my honesty. She went from being suspicious and angry to looking downcast with tears and stifled sighs. "Nonetheless," I continued, telling her about the way my mother cared for him, his daily activities, and the strange things he did due to his mental instability. Finally, I explained the circumstances of his death and funeral before moving on to the events that led me to the city, my employment with Welbeck, and my ambiguous behavior in her presence. I left no stone unturned, no question unanswered. "I have finished my tale," I said, "and fulfilled my purpose in coming here. Whether I have proven my innocence from your suspicions I cannot say. I have done all I can to clear my name and fulfill my duty. What more is there to say? If you have any questions, I am willing to answer them. If not, I will leave without fuss, as you requested." "I was not expecting your story," she replied. "I believe it, and regret the suspicions I had of you." She fell into a sad silence before continuing. "The news I received from another source about that unfortunate boy confuses and surprises me. It does not match your story, but there must be some mistake that I cannot unravel. Welbeck, who has caused you so much trouble." "Trouble?" I interrupted. "Dear madam, it has brought me knowledge of the world I live in. It has led me to where I am now. It has introduced me to many good people and allowed me to witness and receive acts of kindness and generosity. My connection to Welbeck has been useful to me and allowed me to help others. I look back on the events that led me to his doorstep with gratitude and joy." "I wish with all my heart," I said, my tone shifting slightly, "that my association with Welbeck had been harmless for everyone, not just myself. That no one had suffered greater harm to their fortune, reputation, innocence, or even life than I have. There is one person whose connection to him was similar to mine in origin and circumstance, but the outcome was vastly different and tragic. But at this moment, I have a thought that gives me some comfort and hope. You, dear madam, are wealthy. These spacious rooms and abundant resources are yours. You have enough for yourself and more. Would you take in an unhappy girl, robbed of her fortune, reputation, and honor by Welbeck's schemes? She is now in poverty, grieving over the loss of her child, surrounded by vice, and on the brink of infamy." "What does this mean?" the lady asked. "Who are you talking about?" "You will know her. I will tell you her story as much as I know. She is a stranger, an Italian, named Clemenza Lodi." "Clemenza Lodi! Good heavens!" Mrs. Wentworth exclaimed. "It can't be. Are you that person?" "I don't understand, madam. A friend told me a strange story not an hour ago. It mentioned Clemenza Lodi and a peculiar young man. Please tell me what you were doing on Thursday morning." "I was traveling to this city from a distant place. I stopped at the house of—" "Mrs. Villars?" she interjected. "Yes. Perhaps you know her and can confirm or correct my current opinion of her. It is there that unfortunate Clemenza resides, and it is from there that I want her to be promptly removed," I said excitedly. "I have heard about you and your actions on that occasion." "About me?" I responded, surprised. "Do you know that woman?" I showed her the card the woman I encountered at Mrs. Villar's house had given to me with her name written on it. "I know her well. She is my fellow countrywoman and my friend," Mrs. Wentworth said. "Your friend? Then she must be good, innocent, and generous. Will she become a sister, a protector, for Clemenza? Will you encourage her to show kindness? Will you be an example of benevolence? Please tell me where Miss Fielding is. I have already visited her, but she wasn't home, and time is of the essence." "Why are you in such a rush? What do you plan to do?" she asked. "I want to take Clemenza away from that house immediately and bring her here. I want to place her under your protection, with you as her counselor, friend, and mother. Shall I do this? Shall I go there today, right now? If you give me your consent, she will be with you before noon." "No, absolutely not," she replied earnestly. You are too impulsive. Such an important matter cannot be resolved in an instant. There are many difficulties and uncertainties that need to be addressed first. Let's deal with those later. Don't withhold your helping hand until all the obstacles have vanished. Think about the danger that is already looming over her. This is not the time to hesitate and waver. I will tell you her story, but not now. We will postpone it until tomorrow. And first, let's protect her from the imminent dangers. She will tell you her story herself. I will bring her here in an hour, and she will share her sorrows with you. Will you allow me to do this? Your behavior is extraordinary. I can hardly determine if this simplicity is genuine or feigned. Surely common sense would dictate the impropriety of your request. Allowing a woman who is notorious for her dishonor and is from an infamous house to enter my home is not something I can easily agree to, Mrs. Wentworth said adamantly. My dearest madam, how can you not feel pity for her situation? You are fully aware of her past calamity and present danger. Shouldn't these factors urge you to help her immediately? Is there any state more perilous or lot more deplorable than hers? Poverty is not the only thing that oppresses or threatens her. The world's scorn, her own compunction, the death of her child, and the witness of her shame are not the worst. She is exposed to the temptations of the profligate, and if she remains with Mrs. Villars, her infamy will accumulate, her further debasement will be facilitated, and her return to reputation and virtue will be obstructed by new bars, I said, trying my best to explain Clemenza's pitiful circumstances. How do I know that her debasement is not already complete and irremediable? She is a mother but not a wife. How did she become this way? Is it not proof of her guilt that she was Welbeck's prostitute? I do not know. However, I do not believe her to be very culpable. She is unfortunate, robbed, and betrayed. You are a stranger to her history, and I am myself imperfectly acquainted with it. But let me tell you what I do know. Perhaps my narrative may cause you to think of her as I do. She did not object to this proposal, and I immediately recounted everything I had learned from my own observations and Welbeck himself regarding this forsaken girl. Once I finished my narrative, I continued. Can you hesitate to use the power that has been entrusted to you for good purposes to rescue this sufferer? Take her into your home, into your heart, into your confidence. Keep her away from the temptations that surround her in her current situation. Provide her with a safe haven, where she can find solace and support. Restore her to the purity that may have been lost due to her desolate condition, ignorance, misplaced gratitude, and the deceit of a skilled manipulator, if it is indeed lost. How do we know the circumstances under which her downfall occurred? What pretenses, appearances, or promises were used to coerce her into compliance? True, I admit my lack of knowledge, but shouldn't that ignorance be dispelled before she becomes a part of my household? She asked. Oh no, it can be dispelled afterward. It cannot be dispelled beforehand. By bringing her here, you can at least shield her from potential future harm. You can observe her behavior and discern her true sentiments conveniently and at your leisure. If she proves herself deserving of your kindness, you can congratulate yourself on your timely intervention in her plight. If she proves unworthy, you can then respond accordingly based on her actions. I need time to consider. Perhaps tomorrow. In my passion, I cut in. Let me persuade you to admit her immediately, without delay. This very moment could be critical. Today we can exert our efforts with a chance of success, but tomorrow our efforts may be in vain. Why hesitate? Why linger when so much good can be accomplished and no harm can possibly befall you? It only requires a word from you. You don't even need to lift a finger. Your house is spacious, and you have vacant and suitable chambers. Just consent to not bar your door against her and to treat her with civility. It will be my responsibility to bring your kindness into action, to convince her to accompany me here, and to entrust herself to your care. Despite numerous pleas and arguments of a similar nature, they were all in vain. While she had a kind disposition, she was unaccustomed to making sudden or strenuous decisions. She couldn't embrace the persuasions of an advocate for such an unconventional plan. To share her home with a person entirely unknown to her, burdened with suspicion and infamy. At last, I ceased my importunity, and instead asked when I could meet with Mrs. Fielding at her lodgings. The purpose of my meeting was openly disclosed. However, the lady was taken aback by my request. "Are you out of your mind, young man?" she exclaimed. "Mrs. Fielding has already been extremely imprudent. Based on a tenuous acquaintance with Mrs. Villars from their time in Europe, She allowed herself to be lured into a visit. Despite numerous signs of the true character of that woman, evident in her behavior and that of her visitors, Mrs. Fielding consented to stay there for a night. The astonishing encounter with you took place the next morning, as she has since described it to me. She has now been cautioned against making the same mistake again. So, what kind of good plan do you have in mind for her? Does Mrs. Fielding possess wealth? Is she rich? I inquired. She does. Unfortunately, perhaps she is in complete control of her fortune and has no guardian or parent to oversee its use, she replied. Does she possess virtue? Does she understand the value of wealth and a good reputation? And would she not be willing to devote a few dollars to rescue a fellow human being from poverty, infamy, and vice? Surely she would. She risks nothing by granting this favor. I will act as her intermediary. I will provide the wretched stranger with food, clothing, and shelter. I will pay for everything if Mrs. Fielding from her abundance can supply the means. Clemenza's life and honor shall be owed to your friend until I can provide the necessary sum from my own resources. While I spoke, Mrs. Wentworth stared at me intently. I cannot make sense of you. Your words and ideas resemble those of a lunatic. Are you acquainted with Mrs. Fielding? Yes, I saw her 2 days ago, and she invited me to see her again, I replied. And based on this acquaintance, you expect to act as her intermediary, to be her medium of charity? I offer my services as a means of helping her, not as a burden, he said. I wish to make charity as easy as possible. It would be better if she performed these actions herself, as it would reflect well on her intelligence and virtue. However, I only ask that she extends her kindness to Clemenza. It is only for this poor young lady that I request her generosity and compassion. Do you truly believe that she would entrust her money to someone of your age and gender, whom she barely knows, to help someone she found in such a place as Mrs. Villars? The woman asked skeptically. She never would. She mentioned the unwise decision to meet with you, but she has since been warned against such foolishness. You have told me plausible stories about yourself and Clemenza. I cannot say that I completely disbelieve them, but I am well aware of the ways of the world and do not easily give my trust. You are an unusual young man. You may be honest, but it is difficult to believe that someone with your education and charm has spent their entire life in poverty. I believe most of the facts you have stated about my nephew, as I knew him well before his disappearance and can detect any falsehoods. However, there must be more evidence than a clear conscience and a silver tongue to make me fully believe your claims. I have no hold over Welbeck that could cause trouble for you. On that front, you are free from any interference from me or my acquaintances. I did suspect you of being involved in a nefarious plot, but I am now willing to acquit you. However, that is all you can expect from me until your character is proven by something other than your own words. I'm afraid I must ask you to cut your visit short, as I'm currently engaged, Mrs. Wentworth said in a tone much different from the one she had used before. Despite her mild demeanor, it was clear that her unfavorable opinion of me had returned with full force. This sudden change caught me off guard and left me feeling uneasy. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. That's when I heard a knock on the door. In walked the same woman I had met at Villars. I caught a glimpse of her figure through the window. Mrs. Wentworth shot me a series of meaningful glances, urging me to leave, but it was impossible to do so without appearing impolite. As soon as the woman entered, her eyes locked onto mine. Memories came flooding back, causing her cheeks to flush. There was a moment of confusion, but it quickly dissipated. The woman didn't acknowledge me, instead exchanging pleasantries with her friend. Meanwhile, I stood by the window feeling incredibly uncomfortable. I was experiencing strange tremors that I had never felt before, and they seemed to be connected to the woman's presence. I was torn between leaving and staying, not knowing which would be the best course of action. Eventually, I mustered up the courage to approach her and showed her the card she had given me. I stopped by your lodgings an hour ago, as per your instructions, but you weren't there. Can I come by again sometime soon? I asked. She kept her eyes fixed on the ground and seemed to be paying more attention to Mrs. Wentworth than to me. Finally, she spoke up in a hesitant voice. I'll be home this evening, she said. Then I'll come by to see you tonight, I replied before leaving the house. The wait until that evening felt like an eternity, but I had to endure it with composure. I was eager to leave for Baltimore, but had to deal with the matter of Clemenza first. After dinner, I joined Mrs. Stevens on a visit to Miss Carleton, whom I was anxious to meet after hearing about her ability to handle adversity. She greeted us at her door with a serious demeanor that was softened by her friendly smile. I whispered to my friend, "She is truly lovely, but are her heart and intelligence as impressive as her appearance?" My friend assured me they were, explaining how Miss Carleton's actions and acceptance of her brother's unfortunate circumstances demonstrated her worth. I couldn't take my eyes off her and felt a strong desire to gain her approval. "This is my husband's friend," said my friend, introducing me. "He knows about your situation and wants to be your friend too." Miss Carleton looked at me kindly and replied, "I welcome his friendship and will do my best to prove him right." We then engaged in a conversation where Miss Carleton displayed a sharp mind and a carefree attitude. She didn't hide her struggles or needs, and found a silver lining in every misfortune. Her openness encouraged me to inquire about her brother's imprisonment and the cause of his debt. Without hesitation, she answered honestly, "It's a debt from his father, for which he assumed responsibility during his father's lifetime. It was a kind but foolish act, as the consequences have shown. However, at the time, the unfortunate outcome was unforeseeable. My father," she continued, "was arrested by his creditor at a time when he needed the calm and comfort of his own home for his health. The creditor was unyielding, and would only release him if my brother agreed to a bond in which he promised to pay the debt in small portions over time. All the installments were paid with great difficulty but with enough punctuality, except the last, which my brother's earnings could not cover." "How much is the debt?" he asked. $400, she replied. "Is the creditor's situation such that the loss of $400 is more important to him than the loss of your brother's freedom?" he inquired. She smiled and answered, "That is a very theoretical perspective. You and I could easily decide in favor of my brother, but wouldn't that be a biased decision? His actions prove his decision, and it cannot be changed. Can't we persuade him with reasoning? In such a straightforward case, I believe I can convince him. You said he is wealthy and childless. His annual income is 10 times more than the debt. Your brother cannot pay the debt while imprisoned, but if he were free, he could slowly repay it. If his compassion doesn't sway him, his greed might," I explained. "But there is another passion that may be harder to overcome, his revenge. He feels wronged, and is imprisoning my brother not to collect payment, but to inflict misery. If you could convince him that imprisonment is not a hardship, you would quickly win the argument. However, that would be dishonest. The more my brother suffers, the more satisfaction he finds in his actions." "That description seems extreme and hard to believe," I said. "And yet, it could apply to almost every other person we meet," she replied. "Is that truly your opinion of humanity? Your experiences must have been quite unfortunate to lead you to think so poorly of others." "Not at all. My experiences, while perhaps unfortunate to those who only see the surface, have been balanced between good and bad. I have encountered kindness and goodness in many people, but I have also encountered prejudice and bitterness. My opinion of Farquhar is not unfounded. I saw him yesterday, and his motives in his treatment of my brother were quite clear." The conversation shifted to other topics, and it continued until the time arrived for me to visit Mrs. Fielding as we had planned. I left my 2 friends and went to see her. I was granted access to Mrs. Fielding without any hesitation or difficulty. There were 2 women and 1 well-dressed older gentleman in her company. They were discussing political matters, which I had limited knowledge of. They talked about fleets, armies, and figures like Robespierre and Pitt, whom I only knew from newspapers. After a short while, the women put on their cloaks and left with the gentlemen. Left alone with Mrs. Fielding, we both displayed some awkwardness. After some hesitation that gradually faded, my companion finally began the conversation. "You recently encountered me in a situation, sir, that fills me with trembling and shame, but I don't condemn myself for it. I found myself swept up in the whole affair, though I cannot say that I was to blame. Perhaps I was too trusting, too eager to reconnect with a fellow countrywoman in a foreign land. Mrs. Villiers had always been above reproach in England, and I saw no reason to doubt her now. She invited me to her home with such fervor that I could not resist. She even insisted that we leave at once in a carriage that she had come to the city in, and I foolishly agreed. I don't know you, and I'm unfamiliar with your character. The little I've seen of your behavior, and what Mrs. Wentworth recently told me didn't give me a negative impression. But I felt it necessary to apologize to protect my own reputation, regardless of what your character may be." She paused for a moment. "I didn't come here seeking an apology," I said. Your actions during our first meeting were enough to dispel any suspicions or doubts I might have had. What you just mentioned was also mentioned by your friend, and was believed based on her testimony. My reason for coming here wasn't about you, but about someone else. I simply wanted to appeal to your generosity and fairness on behalf of someone who is in a desperate and dangerous situation, deserving of your compassion and help. I understand, she replied, looking somewhat confused. I am aware of that person's claims. And will you fulfill those claims? I asked. How can I help her? She inquired. By providing her with the means to live, I answered. Doesn't she already have means of her own? She questioned. She is destitute. She relied entirely on someone who has passed away, someone who dishonored her and stole her fortune. But she is still alive. She hasn't been thrown out onto the streets. She is not homeless. But it is not a good one, I replied. It's the home she chooses to stay in, she argued. She cannot truly choose it. She must not choose it. She remains there out of ignorance or because she doesn't have the ability to leave, I explained. But how can she be convinced to change her situation? She questioned. I will persuade her. I will fully explain her circumstances to her. I will provide her with a new home, I assured her. So, you want to persuade her to come with you and live in a home that you provide for her, relying on your support? She asked. Yes, exactly, I confirmed. Would such a change be appropriate for a cautious person? Would it benefit her reputation? Would it demonstrate her independence? She inquired. My intentions are good, and I see no reason why she should suspect them. I simply want to be the means through which she receives help. Let her be aided by someone of her own gender, someone with an unquestionable reputation. Bring her into this house, embrace her as a sister, provide her with care and comfort, I suggested. Should I do all that before I am convinced that she deserves it? And even then, how would it reflect on my reputation as a young, unmarried, independent, and wealthy woman to harbor a woman in her circumstances? She raised valid concerns. But you wouldn't have to take action yourself. Make me your representative and intermediary. Just provide her with the means to survive through me, I proposed. Are you suggesting that I engage in clandestine activities, meeting secretly with a man and giving him money for a purpose that I must hide from the world? Is it worth becoming a deceiver and imposter? And wouldn't such behavior invite more dangerous suspicions and assumptions compared to acting openly and directly? Please understand that, given my situation, I must be very cautious in my interactions with men and strangers. This is only the second time I've met you, and my knowledge of you is uncertain and incomplete. Considering this, the course of action you propose would be rash and blameworthy, she pointed out. I shall not be pursuing this matter any further, she said firmly and with dignity. Her words did not escape my notice, and I could not help but acknowledge the truth of what she had said. I must confess, I replied, that what you have said has made me question the propriety of my proposal. However, I still wish to be of service to her. Can you suggest a practical solution? She remained silent and contemplative, seemingly reluctant to answer my question. I was determined to succeed in this negotiation, I continued, and could not foresee any obstacles in my way. But I have come to realize that my ignorance of the ways of the world is greater than I had anticipated. You deprive yourself of the joy that comes from making others happy. You value appearances more than substance, and are more concerned with avoiding unjust accusations than rescuing a fellow human from guilt and shame. You are wealthy, and enjoy all the comforts and luxuries of life. A small portion of your excess could alleviate the needs of someone who is no less deserving than yourself. It is not greed or laziness that keeps you from lending a hand. It is the fear of ridicule and ignorance. I won't push you further at the moment. Your decision to be cautious shouldn't be rushed. Reflect on the matter calmly and thoughtfully, and make your decision within the next 3 days. I will visit you again at the end of that period. With that, I withdrew without waiting for a response. The next day at dawn, I boarded the stagecoach with a pale Frenchman from Santo Domingo, his violin case, an ape, and 2 black women. Once we left the outskirts of town, the Frenchman took out his violin and entertained himself with a tune, humming along. The monkey would occasionally eat an apple given to him from a basket by the black people. They looked at everything with a strange wonder and would say, "La, la," in amazement. They also chattered to each other in a strange and repetitive way. The man didn't pay much attention to his surroundings and only spoke when scolding the monkey, saying things like, "Tenez, Dominique, prenez garde, diable noir." As for me, my mind was occupied with various thoughts. Sometimes I looked at the faces of my four companions and tried to notice their similarities and differences. I carefully observed the features, proportions, looks, and gestures of the monkey, the person from Congo, and the Creole Gaul. I compared them to each other and studied them individually. I examined them from many different angles and reflected on each change in their expressions, features, and postures. I also paid attention to the passing scenery, taking note of the shape and material of fences, barns, and cottages, as well as the appearance of the land and sky. It's amazing how much joy comes from being healthy and mentally active. My main focus, however, was on the scenes I was about to enter. My imagination was, of course, crude and inadequate, and I found great satisfaction in comparing the realities that occurred with the pictures that my wayward fancy had painted. I will not describe my dreams. My duty is to relate the truth. I will not dwell on the images suggested by the condition of the country through which I passed. I will only mention the events that were connected to the purpose of my journey. I arrived in Baltimore at night. I was not so tired that I could not explore the city. At the moment, I only sought to satisfy my curiosity as a stranger. I planned to visit Mrs. Watson and her brother the next day. On the evening of my arrival, I thought it might not be a good time to visit them. However, as I wandered around, I realized that it might be a good idea to find their house even at this hour. Whether I found their dwelling now or tomorrow wouldn't affect my general curiosity. Plus, if I found their home tonight, I could save myself the trouble of asking around tomorrow. But as I looked ahead to meeting Watson's wife and the necessary conversation we would have, I felt a mix of fear and doubt in my heart. I knew that I should be extremely cautious and tactful, but these qualities don't come naturally to my impulsive and honest nature. How am I going to introduce myself? What should I say to her? Should I tell her that I witnessed her husband's murder, that I received a letter from his killer, which I later sent to her, and also that I received the money from his belt from the same person? She will be shocked and suspicious. She'll have questions for me. How can I disarm and evade them or provide honest answers? I needed to think deeply before I exposed myself to such a meeting. I decided to spend the night reflecting on this matter. With these thoughts in mind, I started asking around about the street mentioned in the advertisement, where Mrs. Watson was supposed to live. I eventually found the street and located the house. Standing across the street, I paused and observed the building. It was a modest two-story wooden house, simple but well kept. You had to climb several stone steps to reach the front door. One of the lower windows had its shutters closed while the other was open. Even though it was late in the evening, there was no sign of light or fire inside. Next to the house stood a freshly painted fence, with a gate leading to the back of the building. On a whim, I crossed the street and entered the paved alley through the gate, flanked by a paled fence and the house. As I walked down the alley, I noticed two windows. The first was dark, but the second glowed with light. Curious, I approached the window and peered inside. The room was a simple but tidy space that seemed to combine a parlor, kitchen, and nursery. A fire crackled in the hearth, and a tea kettle bubbled on top. In a rocking chair sat a woman dressed in plain but neat clothing, cradling a sleeping infant. Half of her face was visible, and I could see the sadness that shadowed her gentle features. Her eyes were fixed on the fire, and tears glistened on her lashes as she sang a soft lullaby. Beside her sat a cherubic boy, laughing and tossing something to a young black girl. Her features were regular and innocent, and only her skin tone marred her beauty. I was lost in thought, studying the mother's face, when the black girl suddenly cried out in surprise and fear, "Oh, see there, a man!" I realized that I had been seen and considered leaving abruptly, but decided against it, not wanting to cause any alarm. As I approached the door, I felt the need to apologize for my intrusion into this unfamiliar place. I quickly located the door that led to the same room and knocked. A somewhat confused voice instructed me to come in. It wasn't until I entered the room that I realized the predicament I had unknowingly placed myself in. I was barely able to find the courage to speak, and simply nodded in response to the question, "Do you have business with me, sir?" The woman offered me a chair, and I sat down. She handed the still sleeping child to the black woman, who kissed and rocked the infant with great satisfaction. The woman then resumed her seat and looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and contentment. After a brief pause, I spoke up. "I was directed to this house as the residence of Mr. Ephraim Williams. Is he available to see me, madam?" "He is not currently in town. "If you leave a message with me, I will make sure it is delivered to him promptly," she replied. I suddenly wondered if it was necessary to do anything more than leave the bills, which were already properly enclosed in a packet. Perhaps this would allow me to avoid any uncomfortable explanations, and I could even congratulate myself on his timely absence. With these thoughts in mind, I handed her the packet and said, "I will leave this in your care and earnestly request that you keep it safe until you can deliver it directly to him." But just as quickly as I had made the decision, I began to question its morality. Was it right to act in such a secretive and mysterious manner? Should I leave these people uncertain about the fate of their loved one? What kind of confusion, misunderstandings, and suspense might arise from this uncertainty? Shouldn't I do everything in my power to prevent this, even if it meant risking my own safety and reputation? These thoughts caused me to involuntarily reach out to retrieve the packet. The woman's demeanor changed as I spoke, her face contorting with a mixture of emotions that I could not decipher. The significance of my gestures and the weight of my words caused her to tremble with fear and confusion. Though she tried to hide it, her trepidation was palpable, and her effort to compose herself only made it more apparent. Finally she spoke, her voice faltering as she made a promise to take care of the papers and give them to her brother. As she rose to put the papers away, I felt a strange sense of unease settle over me. Though I couldn't explain it, I knew that this moment was different from any other I had experienced before. My thoughts were scattered, and I found myself unable to speak or move. She seemed to sense my distress, and her own fear and anguish were evident in the glances she cast my way. Without words, we communicated a deep understanding of each other's thoughts and feelings. But this strange connection could not last forever. Gradually, I regained my composure and looked at her with a seriousness that brooked no argument. I asked her if she was the wife of Amos Watson, and she confirmed it with surprise. It was then that I revealed my knowledge of her husband's fate. Her reaction was one of shock and dismay, and she begged me for information about his whereabouts and condition. But when I told her that he would never return to her, her despair was palpable. She asked me why he had forsaken her, and I responded with solemnity, telling her that there was a good reason for his absence. I told her that many years had passed since he was laid to rest in the cold grave. Upon hearing this, she let out a piercing scream and then collapsed onto the floor in a faint. I was immediately concerned for her well-being. The two children in the room were also shrieking and running around in a state of terror. Despite feeling overwhelmed with fear myself, I instinctively picked her up and searched for a way to revive her. Before I could do so, several of her neighbors burst into the room, having been alerted by the commotion. They eyed me with suspicion at first, but quickly realized that I was not responsible for the woman's condition. The neighbors helped the woman to a nearby bedroom, where she eventually came to her senses. I knew that there was nothing more I could do for her at that moment, so I quietly slipped out of the room and returned to my inn. In a matter of minutes, my plans had been completely upended. I had never intended to reveal myself to this woman, but circumstances had forced my hand. I knew that I would have to tread carefully in the future, especially when it came to dealing with her brother. But for now, I was content to retreat to my room and reflect on the strange turn of events that had just taken place. I shall disclose all that I know, for withholding information would harm both myself and others. However, before I do so, I must meet with the Morrises. Chapter 25. The following morning, I woke up early and got myself ready promptly. I had quite a distance to cover, about 8 or 10 miles, as the people whom I needed to meet lived far from the town. They were a mother and her 3 daughters, whom I had only heard of through their names and residence. I was bringing them a fortune, something that they must have given up hope of ever recovering. I was the least likely messenger to be expected to bring them such a gift, given my age and appearance. I arrived at Mrs. Morris's home at 11 o'clock, following a difficult and confusing path. Her house was a charming and picturesque dwelling, nestled in a valley that would undoubtedly be breathtaking when adorned with the greenery and blooms of the upcoming season. However, at present, it was barren and bleak. As I walked down a long avenue towards the house, I spotted 2 women walking arm in arm, strolling slowly along the path that I was on. These must be the daughters, I thought to myself. From a distance, they appeared to be fashionable, well-dressed and graceful. I hoped that they would be deserving of the good news that I had brought for them. They turned towards the house, and I quickened my pace, hoping to catch up to them and request an introduction to their mother. As I approached, they turned again and stood, seemingly expecting me. I approached them and took a quick glance at each of them, suspecting that they were not sisters. Unfortunately, neither of them had a particularly striking or attractive countenance. They were two women dressed in ordinary clothes that one might see in markets and streets, without any fancy adornments or head coverings. Their demeanor was somewhat arrogant and disdainful, which made them less attractive. However, their attitude did not bother me. I asked the older-looking woman about Mrs. Morris. "She is sick," she replied coldly. "That's unfortunate. Can I see her?" I asked. "No," she replied with even more seriousness. I was unsure how to proceed from there. A moment of silence passed. Finally, the same woman spoke up again. "What do you want? You can leave a message with me." "I don't want to leave a message with anyone else. If she's not too sick," I started to say, but she interrupted me. "She's very sick and cannot be disturbed. If you can't leave a message, take it back with you." This was a strange reception, and I was left speechless. "Perhaps another time," I said hesitantly. "No," she replied with increasing hostility. "There will be no other time. She will probably get worse, not better. Come, Betsy," she said, grabbing her companion's arm and hurrying into the house, slamming the door behind her. I stood at the bottom of the steps, completely bewildered by such unexpected behavior. I couldn't leave without accomplishing my purpose. After a moment's hesitation, I approached the door and rang the bell. A gruff-looking black man opened the door and stared at me silently. When I asked if I could see Mrs. Morris, he replied in a language I couldn't understand. Suddenly, a voice from inside the house spoke up. "Mrs. Maurice cannot be seen by anyone. Come in, Cato, and close the door." Cato obeyed the command without a word. What a predicament. I had £10,000 with me to give to these people, and yet they treated me like this. "I need to change my approach," I said to myself. Without further hesitation, I lifted the latch and entered a room on my right, which happened to have its door open. Inside, I found the two women I had spoken to earlier in the portico. I directed my words to the younger woman, saying, "Once I explain the reason for my intrusion, I hope you will forgive me. I have come, madam." "Yes," interrupted the other woman, her face filled with anger. "I know exactly who sent you and what is motivating this insolence, but your employer will see that we haven't sunk as low as he thinks. Cato, Bob, come here." "Madam, you are mistaken. I have no employer. I have traveled a great distance. I have come to bring you and your family extremely important news. I have come to help, not to harm you." At that moment, Bob and Cato, two strong black men, entered the room. The imperious lady commanded, paying no attention to my explanations, "Take this person and throw them out of the house. Can't you hear me?" she continued, noticing that they exchanged glances and hesitated. "Madam, you are being hasty. You are treating me like an enemy when I am here to prove myself a true friend to your mother." "Will you leave the house?" she exclaimed, her anger getting the best of her. "Villains! Why aren't you doing as I told you?" The two black men looked at each other, seemingly waiting for an example. Their ingrained deference to white people likely held them back from what they considered a disrespectful act. Finally, Bob spoke in a pleading tone. "Please, miss, the gentleman wants to go, so let him go." The lady now burst into tears of anger. She extended her hand threateningly. "Will you leave the house?" "Not willingly," I replied calmly. "I traveled a long way and couldn't turn back without completing the important task that brought me here. I assure you, madam, that you misunderstand my intentions and who I am. I have a message for your mother, a message that deeply concerns her and your happiness, assuming you are her daughter. I simply wanted to meet her and share some significant news that greatly impacts her fortune." These words had a remarkable effect on the young lady. Her anger subsided. "Oh my goodness," she exclaimed. "Are you Watson?" "No, I'm only representing Watson and doing everything he would do if he were here." She became eager to know the nature of my business. "My business concerns Mrs. Morris. I saw advertisements directing me to her in this house, and I will only deliver my message to her." "Perhaps," she said apologetically, "I have misunderstood you. Mrs. Morris is my mother. She is actually unwell, but I can stand in for her on this occasion. You cannot replace her in this matter. If I cannot speak to her now, then I must leave and return when you are willing to grant me access." "Well," she replied, Perhaps my mother isn't so sick that I can't go and see if she will allow you in." With that, she left me for 3 minutes and returned, saying that her mother wanted to see me. Following her request, I went upstairs and entered a sparsely furnished room. Seated in an armchair was a lady who appeared elderly, pale and visibly frail. The lines on her face didn't demand my respect. They resembled her daughter's too much. She looked at me eagerly upon my arrival and spoke in a sharp tone. "Well, friend, what do you want from me? Hurry up, tell your story, and leave." "My story is brief and straightforward. Amos Watson was your agent in Jamaica. He sold an estate that belonged to you and received the money," I explained. "He did," she exclaimed, trying unsuccessfully to rise from her seat. Her eyes had a meaningful gleam that startled me. "He did, the villain. He stole the money, leading to my ruin and that of my daughters. But if justice exists in this world, it will catch up with him. I hope to see him hanged one day. But please, continue, friend. He did sell it, I tell you." "He sold it for £10,000, I continued, "and he invested this amount in bills of exchange. Watson is now deceased, and these bills came into my possession. Recently I discovered from the newspapers who the rightful owners were, and I have come from Philadelphia with the sole purpose of returning them to you." With that, I placed the bills in her lap, untouched and intact. She grabbed the papers and looked at me and her daughter, alternatingly, with a bewildered expression. She seemed speechless, and suddenly becoming even paler, leaned her head back on the chair. The daughter screamed and hurried to support her weakened mother, who managed to say with difficulty, "Oh, I'm sick to death. Help me to the bed." I was astonished and alarmed by this turn of events. Some of the household staff, both black and white, entered the room and stared at me in surprise. Instinctively I retreated and returned to the room below, where I had first entered, finding it now empty. I was puzzled for some time, trying to understand the cause of these reactions. Eventually it dawned on me that overwhelming joy had caused Mrs. Morris's sudden illness. The unexpected recovery of what she probably believed was irretrievable had understandably affected her fragile state of mind. I was contemplating whether to stay or leave when the daughter entered the room. She expressed surprise at seeing me, assuming I had already departed, and informed me that her mother wanted to see me again before I left. Her request lacked kindness and was filled with coldness, haughtiness, and sullenness. Without inviting me to sit or softening her stern demeanor, Mrs. Morris asked, "Tell me, friend, how did you acquire these papers?" "I assure you, madam, they were obtained honestly," I replied calmly with a slight smile. "However, if everything that was missing is there, the manner and timing of how they came into my possession is a concern solely for myself. Is there any shortage? I'm not certain. I'm not well versed in these matters. There might be less. I presume there is. Soon a friend of mine will arrive to examine them. I have no doubt you can provide a satisfactory explanation for yourself." "I have no doubt I can do so when it is demanded by those who have the right to ask. In this instance, my curiosity must be exceptionally compelling before I consent to satisfy it. You must understand that this is a suspicious situation. Watson, of course, embezzled the money, and undoubtedly you are his accomplice." "Certainly," I responded. "My actions in this matter undoubtedly prove that. By bringing this to you voluntarily and returning it to you completely and unconditionally, it is evident that Watson embezzled it, and that I was assisting in the fraud. Returning something that was never stolen always exposes the thief. Giving away something that could be kept without suspicion is undoubtedly deceitful. On a serious note, madam, I have done enough by coming this far for this purpose, and now I must bid you farewell." "No, please don't leave just yet. I have something more to discuss with you. My friend will be here soon." "Ah, there he is," Mrs. Morris said, noticing the ringing of the bell. "Polly, go downstairs and see if that's Mr. Summers. If it is, bring him up." The daughter left the room, and I stood by the window, lost in my own thoughts. Disappointment and dejection filled my heart. The reality before me was a stark contrast to the hopeful visions I had imagined on my journey here. I anticipated finding virtuous poverty, and witnessing its transformation into prosperity and joy through my actions. I expected tears of gratitude and the warmth of affection. But what did I find? Only greed, ignorance, and unwarranted suspicion. The daughter took longer than her mother's patience could tolerate. Impatiently, the mother knocked her heel against the floor, summoning a servant. "Where's Polly, you good-for-nothing?" "I didn't ask for you, you foolish girl. I wanted her," she scolded. The servant replied, "She's talking with a gentleman in the parlor. Mr. Summers, I suppose. Go with my compliments and tell him to come up." "It's not Mr. Summers, ma'am," the servant replied. Surprised, the mother retorted, "Then who is it, impudent child? What gentleman would have anything to do with Polly?" The servant admitted ignorance, and the mother commanded her to deliver the message to Polly. The summons was either not relayed, or Polly chose not to heed it. 10 minutes passed in thoughtful silence on my part, accompanied by the muttered vexation and impatience of the old lady. Finally, Polly entered the room. The mother immediately began bitterly complaining about Polly's inattention and neglect. However, Polly disregarded her and turned to me, informing me that a gentleman downstairs wished to see me. I hurried downstairs and found a plain-looking stranger in the parlor. His countenance exuded generosity and sincerity. From our conversation, I gathered that he was Watson's brother-in-law and had accompanied him on his final voyage. I couldn't contain my delight at this unexpected encounter, and I eagerly expressed my willingness to share all the knowledge I had about Watson's fate. He informed me that upon his late return to Baltimore the previous evening, he found his sister in a state of distress, which she eventually explained to him. She had also handed him the packets I had left for her. "You can imagine," he continued, "my surprise and curiosity upon this discovery. I was eager to meet the bearer of such extraordinary news. This morning, after inquiring about someone matching your description at the local taverns, I finally learned of your arrival in the stagecoach yesterday, your solitary outing in the evening, and your early departure this morning. By chance, I stumbled upon your trail, and through suitable inquiries along the way, I eventually traced you here. You informed my sister that her husband was deceased and left her with papers that were likely in his possession at the time of his death. Miss Morris mentioned that the bills belonging to her mother had just been delivered to her. I presume you have no objection to clarifying this mystery. I am anxious to reveal everything to you. At this moment, or at any time, the sooner the better for me. I am ready to do so." He glanced around and remarked, "This is not the appropriate place.